My name is Natalie Carter, and I was 34 years old the day I buried the only person who had ever truly raised me. His name was Henry Whitmore. He was my grandfather, although the word never felt large enough for what he had been to me. He taught me how to sand a rough board without splintering the grain, how to balance a checkbook down to the last cent, and how to recognize the people who loved you by noticing who actually showed up. At his funeral, I reserved 2 seats in the front row for my parents. Those seats remained empty through every hymn, every prayer, and every word I read over his coffin. 3 hours later, my parents posted a photograph from a Caribbean beach. Then, before I had even driven away from the cemetery, a text arrived from my grandfather's phone. To understand why that message made the ground seem to shift beneath me, you have to understand the man we had just buried. My parents, Dennis and Lorraine, left me with him when I was 7. There was no dramatic goodbye, and no promise that made sense. They simply had other places they preferred to be, and a child had become an obligation they were tired of carrying. My grandfather was 51 then, a retired carpenter with sawdust permanently worked into the lines of his hands. He did not complain, ask how long I would be staying, or make me feel as though I had ruined the shape of his life. He cleaned out the spare room, bought a moon-shaped nightlight because I was afraid of the dark, and made space for me as though he had been expecting me all along. From that point forward, Henry came to everything. He sat through school plays in which I forgot my lines, and softball games in which I watched the third strike sail past me. He attended every parent-teacher conference, folding himself into chairs built for children while taking serious notes on the back of old receipts. My mother occasionally mailed a birthday card when she remembered which month I had been born. My grandfather never missed a single day that mattered. When I was 9, I finally asked him why my parents did not want me. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. Everything else is noise. Love is not a speech. Love is the person sitting in the chair. For the next 27 years, he was always the person in the chair. He walked me down the aisle when I married my husband, Caleb. He held our daughter, Lily, less than an hour after she was born, and cried without trying to hide it. He remembered every birthday, fixed every loose cabinet hinge, and kept a spare key under the blue flower pot because he wanted me to know I could always come home. I was never confused about who my real family was. That was why the final months of his life still hurt in a way I cannot fully describe. He needed protection then, and although I went to him nearly every evening, I did not understand the danger quickly enough. The cancer started in his pancreas, the kind of illness that seems to arrive already holding the final answer. By spring, chemotherapy had reduced the strongest man I knew to someone who became exhausted lifting a cup. I lived only 20 minutes away, and after finishing work each day, I drove to his house. I handled bookkeeping and account reconciliation for small businesses around town, so my days were built around ledgers, receipts, and numbers that had to make sense. At Henry's house, I made toast he could rarely finish, sorted his medication beside the kitchen sink, and watched the same old westerns with him because repetition felt safe when everything else was changing. That was when my mother returned. Lorraine lived in Florida and had spent most of my life appearing only when there was attention, money, or property close enough to touch. Suddenly, she flew north and announced that she had come to help her father. At first, part of me wanted to believe her. A daughter should come when her father is dying. But within days, she had taken control of his mail, his bank correspondence, his checkbook, and every conversation about money. When I offered to organize his accounts, which was not merely a favor but the work I did professionally, she gave me a thin smile and said, "Daddy wants his privacy, Natalie." I pushed back. I asked to be added as a view-only contact, or at least allowed to monitor unusual activity, because older people undergoing aggressive treatment are easy targets for fraud. Lorraine told me that Henry had arranged things the way he wanted and that it was not my place to interfere. I called the bank myself, but they could not disclose account information to me. Only the account holder, or the person holding his power of attorney, could discuss the accounts, and Lorraine had already been named as his agent. Legally, there was a wall around my grandfather, and my mother's signature was written across it. I knew something was wrong, but I had no proof, authority, or access. I kept telling myself that Lorraine was his daughter, and that grief might be turning suspicion into certainty. So I continued bringing soup, washing dishes, and watching Henry weaken while trusting the relationship she had with him on paper instead of the pattern she had shown me for years. 3 weeks later, he was gone, and I still did not know what she had hidden. Henry died on a Tuesday afternoon in his own bedroom. I was holding one of his hands, and his hospice nurse, Marisol, was holding the other. Lorraine had flown back to Florida 4 days earlier because, in her exact words, she could not simply sit around waiting. After he died, I planned the funeral alone. I chose the hymns, called the church, spoke to the florist, arranged the burial, and wrote the obituary at 2 in the morning while Caleb slept upstairs. Then I called my mother with the date and time. There were splashing sounds and distant music behind her voice. She paused after I told her, then said that she and my father could not return so soon. Flights were expensive. Henry would understand. They would say a prayer from Florida. I remained on the phone after she had finished speaking, waiting for something else, perhaps a change of heart or even embarrassment. She hung up, and I sat at the kitchen table thinking about my grandfather in those tiny school chairs, his knees nearly level with his chest, writing notes on receipts because my life mattered enough for him to pay attention. Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. His words had lived in me for years, yet his own daughter would not attend his funeral. I felt the quiet certainty that comes when an account is wrong even before you find the entry. I told myself the 2 empty seats would be the cruelest thing my parents could do. I was wrong. The funeral took place on a gray Saturday morning. I arrived early and placed 2 folded programs on the front row chairs I had saved for my parents. I knew they had said they were not coming, but hope is irrational when it has been trained for years to survive on scraps. The chapel gradually filled behind me. The Moreno family came because Henry had rebuilt their fence without charging them after a flood. Mr. Caldwell, one of his oldest customers, cried into a handkerchief large enough to cover both hands. A woman I had never met told me that Henry had taught her late husband the carpentry trade and had refused payment until the man found steady work. Nearly half the town appeared for a retired carpenter, while 2 programs remained untouched in the front row. The pastor spoke. Marisol squeezed my shoulder. I stood to read the words I had written in the middle of the night, and somehow, my voice remained steady. Henry had raised me to finish what needed to be finished before allowing myself to collapse. When I returned to my seat, I looked once more at those 2 empty chairs. That was the exact moment my phone vibrated inside the pocket of my black coat. I almost ignored it, but I looked down. It was a photograph my mother had posted publicly. Lorraine stood in a turquoise cover-up, holding a tropical drink, while my father grinned behind her with a sunburned face. There was white sand, impossible blue water, and the polished brightness of a vacation advertisement. Beneath the photograph, she had written 4 cheerful words: "Living our best life." The post had been time-stamped 11 minutes after my grandfather's funeral began. My hand went cold around the phone. I do not remember much of the remaining service. I remember the cemetery afterward, and the damp air against my face. I remember lowering a man into the ground while the 2 people who should have been closest to him were choosing filters for a beach photograph. Later, I sat behind the wheel of my car with the engine off, staring at the post until the screen went dark. I turned it on, and stared again. "Living our best life, their best life," posted, while I was helping bury her father. I had spent my career staying calm through other people's financial disasters, yet in that parking lot I could not find one stable thought. I kept calculating the timeline. Posting 11 minutes into the service meant Lorraine had prepared that photograph during the hour she knew we would be singing Henry's favorite hymn. That was not forgetfulness. It was a choice. I was still holding the phone when it vibrated again. This time, it was a text from a contact, saved under one word: Grandpa. It came from the number I had called almost every evening for months, the number that had gone silent when Marisol pulled the sheet over Henry and I forgot how to breathe. Now his name glowed on my screen as though nothing had happened. "Sweetheart, come to my house right now." I read the message 4 times. I had watched my grandfather die. I had just watched his coffin lowered into the earth. There was no reasonable version of the world in which he could be texting me. My skin tightened with gooseflesh beneath my coat. I looked toward the cemetery, then back at his name. Finally, I started the car. Henry's house was 20 minutes outside town on a road that became gravel near the mailbox. I made the drive in 15. I kept the radio off and tried to list the rational explanations. A delayed message. A stolen phone. A technical error. Someone's unforgivable idea of a joke. Yet, when I reached the property, the porch light was on, the front door was open, and a car I vaguely recognized was parked in the drive. I climbed the steps I had painted beside Henry when I was 12. At the kitchen table sat a broad, heavy-set man in his 60s with reading glasses pushed onto his forehead. Franklin Doyle had been Henry's attorney for 3 decades and, by the end, one of his closest friends. Henry's phone rested in Franklin's hand. He stood the moment he saw my face. "Natalie, I am so sorry. I should have contacted you from my own number, but Henry was afraid you would ignore a stranger after the funeral. He told me you would come for him." I could not answer. Franklin set the phone on the table with both hands, almost reverently. Then he explained that months earlier, Henry had made him promise to contact me immediately after the burial and get me to the house alone. He had specifically instructed Franklin to use his phone because, as Henry had said, "She will drop everything for that name." I looked at the phone, then at the empty chair at the head of the table. This was not a glitch, and not a ghost. It was my grandfather reaching toward me one last time through instructions he had arranged before his death. That meant he had known something was coming. Franklin adjusted his glasses. "There is a box," he said. "He wanted you to have it." It was an old wooden cigar box, the kind Henry normally used for screws, drill bits, and hinges too useful to throw away. My name was written across the lid in his blocky handwriting, although the letters trembled in places. Inside were 3 items: a blue journal, worn soft at the corners, a thick stack of photocopied bank statements organized by month, and a folder containing a durable power of attorney. Lorraine's name appeared on the signature line as Henry's agent. I looked up at Franklin. He folded his hands and told me the truth without softening it. Henry had stopped trusting his daughter. Not at the end. He wanted me to receive more than grief. He wanted me to receive the record of what had happened. Franklin said Henry believed I was the only person who would understand the numbers and the only person who had consistently shown up. I ran my thumb over the journal's blue cover. I could feel the indentations where a weakening hand had pressed too hard against the paper. I was not ready to open it in that kitchen. Still, I understood that my life had separated into a before and an after. Grief had brought me to the house, but whatever was inside that box would decide what came next. I carried the box home with the journal on the passenger seat. One look at my face was enough for him to put the kettle on without asking questions. He repaired electrical systems for a living and instinctively believed broken things should have a fix. I told him about the beach photograph. I told him about the message from a dead man's phone and Franklin waiting at the kitchen table. Then, I opened the journal. Henry's handwriting had always been square, practical, and certain, the hand of a man who measured twice before cutting. The first pages were steady, but the letters gradually loosened as chemotherapy weakened him. Early entries were simply a sick man's notes. A difficult night, a dressing changed by Marisol, soup brought by Natalie, another Western watched together. A few weeks later, the tone changed. "Money is tight again, and I do not know why," he had written. "Lorraine says I spent it. Maybe I did. I get so tired that I cannot remember." I read those lines 3 times. Henry never lost track of money and kept receipts organized by year. Yet Lorraine had made him question whether illness had caused him to spend what he could not remember. Caleb leaned over my shoulder and went still while the kettle screamed behind us. The later pages showed how Lorraine had gained control. After one especially severe chemotherapy session, she had sat Henry at his kitchen table and told him that his mind was no longer reliable. She said managing money had become too much for him and offered to take the burden away. The durable power of attorney had already been prepared. He signed it the day after treatment, when he was too weak to hold a spoon steadily because she was his daughter. He was frightened, and he wanted to believe that the hand reaching toward him was there to help rather than take. Then the entries began listing amounts. $400 out on the 9th. I did not buy anything. A few lines later, $600 on the 15th. Marisol drove me to the pharmacy. I spent $40 all week. Henry had begun creating a private tally in the middle of his illness because the part of him that had always respected numbers recognized the gaps. He could not stop Lorraine from accessing his accounts, but he could still write down what he saw. Near the bottom of one page, he had pressed so hard that the ink nearly tore through. She thinks I am too far gone to count. I am not. I just cannot stop her. The bank talks to her now, not me. Beneath that, he wrote, I gave her the key to the house. And she took the house. Not the building, everything else. I placed the journal beside the bank statements and understood what he had left me. It was not a complete case yet, but it was a map. My grandfather had documented his fear, copied the records he could reach, and organized them for the one person he believed would know how to follow the trail. Numbers were my work, and unlike people, numbers did not alter their story to protect themselves. I spread the statements across our dining table from oldest to newest and began reconciling them. Most people find this kind of work tedious. I find it honest. Numbers do not care who is a mother, a daughter, or a grieving grandchild. They do not love anyone and cannot be intimidated. They simply remain where they were recorded and tell you what happened. The pattern appeared transfer by transfer. Beginning the month after the power of attorney was signed, money left Henry's savings in regular amounts. I separated legitimate medical, pharmacy, and household charges from electronic transfers into the same outside account. Some months, $3,000 disappeared. In others, more than $11,000. Lorraine later called them loans and reimbursements, but there were no receipts, agreements, or purchases showing they benefited Henry. My grandfather was dying one room at a time while his savings traveled south to Florida. I built a spreadsheet as I had done for thousands of clients and watched the running total rise in the final column. Caleb brought me coffee around midnight and remained quiet. He knew the expression I wore when the numbers began forming a story. At 1 in the morning, I pressed both palms flat against the table because my hands were shaking. Grief can make a person distrust her own judgment. It can make you wonder whether anger has distorted what you are seeing. But the entries did not grieve and did not speculate. They matched Henry's notes in date and amount. The truth continued, climbing the column no matter how many times I checked it. Before taking any formal step, I called my mother. I needed to know that I had given her one opportunity to explain. The next morning, I sat in my car so Lily would not overhear and dialed Lorraine in Florida. She answered in a bright voice, still sounding as though she were on vacation. I kept my tone measured and told her I was reviewing Henry's papers. I said there were withdrawals I could not reconcile, and asked directly what the transfers into her account had been used for. The warmth left her voice immediately. That is none of your business. I told her it was my business because I was helping settle his affairs, and because the account records did not make sense. She gave a sharp laugh. His affairs are family business, and last I checked, you are not really family, are you? I said nothing, which gave her room to continue. She told me that Henry had felt sorry for me, and that pity was the only reason he had taken me in. Then she said the sentence she believed would reduce me to the abandoned child she remembered. You were his charity case, Natalie. You were never his blood. His blood is me, and what belonged to him belongs to me. I sat in the driveway with the phone resting in my lap. Charity case, not his blood. She had selected the words carefully. They were meant to make me small, grateful, and ashamed for questioning someone with a biological claim. When I was 9, they might have worked. At 34, I had a journal, a stack of bank statements, and a spreadsheet that did not care whose blood ran through anyone's veins. I called Franklin and asked him to explain the power of attorney as though he were addressing a jury. In his office above the hardware store, he said the document did not give Lorraine ownership. It created a fiduciary duty. She could pay Henry's bills, arrange his care, and manage property for his benefit. She could not invent reimbursements, lend herself money without authority, or treat his accounts as an advance on an inheritance. Franklin told me that taking money under those circumstances was not merely an ugly family dispute. It could constitute a breach of fiduciary duty and, depending on the evidence and amount, financial exploitation of an elder. The first legal step would be a petition in probate court seeking a formal accounting. If granted, the order would require Lorraine to identify and justify each transaction under oath. If she could not support the transfers, the missing money could become the basis for civil recovery and a referral to criminal authorities. Then Franklin looked at me over his glasses and gave me the warning I needed. This is your mother. Once you begin, there may be no quiet way to finish. If the evidence is what you believe it is, she could face criminal charges. A family does not simply return to normal after that. I thanked him and drove home knowing that a legal road existed. It was not immediate or guaranteed. It would require records, sworn statements, hearings, and people reviewing every claim. But it was real, and every part of it led directly through my mother. That night, I could not sleep. I returned to the journal and continued into the final entries, where Henry's handwriting barely held together. Between 2 pages, I found a folded piece of paper torn from a prescription pad. 4 account numbers were written on it: his checking account, his savings account, a certificate of deposit, and another account I did not recognize. Beneath them, he had written one line: "If you are reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them, and I am sorry." I sat on the edge of the bed and read it until the words blurred. More than the beach photograph or the empty chairs, that note broke something open inside me. Henry had known his daughter was taking from him. He had been too sick, too isolated, and too restricted by the authority he had signed away to stop her. Instead of surrendering, he had quietly copied statements, recorded dates, written down account numbers, and arranged for Franklin to deliver everything after his death. Henry was apologizing as though his daughter's betrayal were something he had done to me, but the note also gave me direction. Before sunrise, I stopped asking whether I was overreacting and began finishing his work. The unfamiliar account number belonged to a certificate of deposit Henry had built over roughly 40 years. It was his real nest egg, accumulated through decades of carpentry and careful saving. With Franklin's help, I obtained the records the estate could lawfully request and added the certificate to my spreadsheet. Lorraine had not merely taken smaller amounts from checking and savings. During one of Henry's weakest months, she had used the authority granted by the power of attorney to liquidate the certificate early. She accepted the financial penalty and transferred the remaining balance away from him. I calculated the full total 3 times because I refused to trust the first 2 results: $465,000. That was the amount missing from a man who had struggled to finish a piece of toast. $465,000 had been removed while he sat at his kitchen table writing 400 out on the 9th. I did not buy anything, and allowing himself to wonder whether sickness had made him careless. Nearly $500,000 was disappearing behind him, while his daughter taught him to doubt his own memory. I closed the laptop gently and sat in the dark until the number stopped feeling abstract. It did not make me reckless. It made me certain. Still, a private spreadsheet was not enough. I needed verified records, the power of attorney, Henry's dated notes, and a lawyer who could place them into a process others could examine. The first relative to call was my mother's younger brother, Raymond. I had always considered him the gentler sibling, the uncle who slipped me $5 at Christmas and asked about school when no one else did. He began the conversation carefully. He had heard I was upset about money, and he claimed to understand. Then he asked whether I truly wanted to tear the family apart over Henry's estate. I told him this was not a disagreement over an inheritance. I explained that Lorraine had moved $465,000 from Henry's accounts while he was terminally ill and acting through a power of attorney that required her to protect him. I said I had bank records and his journal. There was a long silence. I could almost hear Raymond recalculating, but he was not measuring the harm done to his father. "Whatever happened, it should stay inside the family," he finally said. "Once lawyers get involved, there may be nothing left for anyone. Lorraine says Dad intended shares for me and your aunt too." There it was. He was not frightened for Henry's dignity. He was frightened that legal fees, restitution, or criminal scrutiny might reduce what he expected to receive. He was standing in a burning house asking me not to call the fire department because the water might damage his furniture. I told him I loved him, then ended the call before anger made me say something I would have to carry forever. That call showed me the real shape of the fight. I would be opposing not only my mother, but every relative willing to rename theft as family business, because the truth threatened an expected inheritance. Families can isolate the person who refuses to protect the lie that benefits everyone else. The person whose hesitation hurt most was Caleb. He waited until Lily was asleep, then sat across from my spreadsheets, with both hands around a mug he was not drinking from. He spoke cautiously, the way he approached a live electrical wire. "Natalie, I love you, and I loved Henry, but maybe we should let this go." I stared at him. He continued, trying to make the argument sound practical rather than disloyal. The money had never belonged to us. Henry could no longer use it. A legal fight could last months or years, consume our savings, and place our daughter in the middle of a public family war. He said he wanted to protect the life we still had, rather than sacrifice it over a dead man's bank account. I knew Caleb was speaking from fear, not cruelty, but his caution still felt like abandonment. "It was never ours. This is about a man who came to every single thing I ever did. If I call what happened private family business, then showing up means nothing, and love becomes whatever people say while waiting for the will." Caleb looked at me for a long time. He did not agree that night. He went upstairs, and I remained alone at the table with Henry's journal. Hundreds of thousands of dollars in unexplained transfers, and no living relative willing to stand next to me. That was when I accepted that I might have to move forward without anyone's approval. Lorraine moved faster than I expected. About a week after our phone call, I drove to Henry's house because I wanted to sit on the porch for a few minutes and think. A real estate sign had been hammered into the front yard. A lockbox hung from the door. My mother had returned from Florida, changed the locks, and placed the property on the market before the flowers on her father's grave had wilted. I stood in the gravel driveway where I had parked hundreds of times and discovered that I could no longer enter the only house that had ever felt unquestionably like home. A lamp was on inside. Through the curtains, I saw Lorraine moving from room to room, packing Henry's belongings. When she noticed my car, she came to the window. She did not open the door or acknowledge me. She simply pulled the curtain closed. I remained there until the porch light clicked off. That detail stayed with me more than the sign or the lockbox. For 27 years, Henry had left that light on whenever I was coming. My mother reached over and extinguished it while I stood outside. She was not only selling his building, she was erasing the invitation he had spent my entire life extending to me. I drove home understanding Lorraine's strategy. She would sell the house, remove what remained, and rely on the belief that no daughter would take her mother to court. She was betting that years of being called ungrateful, disloyal, and not truly family would still keep me quiet. When silence did not work, she used a threat. Lorraine called in a tone so polished that I suspected she had rehearsed it, perhaps after speaking with an attorney. She said she knew I had been consulting lawyers. If I pursued the matter, she would tell everyone that I had manipulated a dying, confused old man. According to the story she was preparing, I had isolated Henry, poisoned him against his daughter, controlled his papers, and invented accusations because I wanted an inheritance to which I had no biological right. "You have no idea how this looks," she said. The charity case granddaughter, alone with a sick man, managing his affairs, and suddenly claiming money is missing. "You throw one stone, and I will throw 10. She was reversing the roles before any formal accusation. In her version, the person controlling the accounts was the victim, and the granddaughter who visited nightly was the opportunist. The threat frightened me because a court would not automatically see 27 years of ordinary care. It would see records, testimony, missing money, and two relatives accusing each other. For nearly an hour, I wondered whether her story might work. Then, I separated fear from evidence. I had Henry's journal written during the transfers, copied statements, account numbers, the signed power of attorney, and matching dates. Those records existed before Lorraine knew I had found them. She could tell 10 stories. I needed one verifiable account. Franklin referred me to Elena Marquez, an attorney whose practice focused on elder law and contested estates. She was the first person outside my home to examine the spreadsheet, without flinching or trying to reduce the matter to family conflict. I sat across from her while she reviewed Henry's journal, the bank statements, the power of attorney, the certificate records, and my reconciliation. She read silently for almost 20 minutes, occasionally marking dates on a yellow pad. When she finished, she removed her glasses and said, "Most financial exploitation cases involving an older adult begin in fog. Records are missing. Memories conflict. Someone was confused, and the court has to decide which incomplete account is more reliable. This is different. Your grandfather documented his concerns while they were happening, and the bank records appear to confirm the pattern." Elena explained the process in realistic terms. We could petition the probate court for a judicial accounting and ask for temporary protection of estate assets, including the house, while the transactions were reviewed. If the court ordered an accounting, Lorraine would have to identify the purpose of each transfer and support her explanation with records. A label such as caregiver reimbursement would not be enough by itself. She would need receipts, agreements, invoices, or other evidence showing that the expense benefited Henry. If Lorraine could not account for the money, the probate court could order restitution and additional civil consequences. Separate authorities could then investigate possible elder exploitation. Elena promised nothing about arrest or conviction, but the amount, Henry's vulnerability, and Lorraine's fiduciary role created serious exposure. Then Elena gave me the same warning Franklin had. "Before I file anything, you need to understand the direction of travel. You may begin with an accounting, but if the documents hold, the matter could end with your mother facing felony charges. Once authorities take control of the criminal side, you may not be able to stop it simply because the family changes its mind." I sat in her office with everything I feared and everything I wanted resting in the same folder. There was now a practical path forward, but it ran over the last remaining illusion that Lorraine and I might someday have a normal mother-daughter relationship. I asked Elena for one night to decide. That night was harder than the funeral, because this time I had to choose. Filing could make Lorraine a civil defendant and perhaps a criminal suspect. She might lose property, reputation, or freedom. Whatever thin thread remained between us would be cut, and I would be the one holding the scissors. The 9-year-old version of me was still somewhere inside, convinced that if I stayed agreeable enough, my mother might eventually turn around and choose me. That child had learned to survive by accepting crumbs without complaint. Keep the peace. Do not make trouble. Be grateful for whatever you receive. I felt those instructions pulling at me while I sat alone at the dining table. Then I opened Henry's journal to the words he had once spoken to a frightened child and later written for a grieving woman. "Showing up is the whole thing, sweetheart. For most of my life, I had misunderstood him. I thought showing up meant remaining in the room regardless of how people treated you. I thought loyalty meant absorbing the damage so no one else had to feel uncomfortable. But Henry had never shown up for me by shrinking. He had shown up by standing between me and the people who had abandoned me. Even at the end, when he lacked the strength to protect himself openly, he had used what remained to document the truth and place it in my hands. Showing up was not passive endurance. It was standing where the truth required you to stand. He had done that for me for 27 years. The least I could do was stand for him when he could no longer speak. I closed the journal and, in my own mind, put the 9-year-old child to bed. The following morning, I called Elena and told her to file. We filed on a Thursday. I took the morning away from work and sat in Elena's office while she reviewed every document before I signed it. The petition requested a judicial accounting and protection of the estate's assets. A separate report summarized the suspected financial exploitation and attached the records available at that point. My affidavit described what I had observed, how the box reached me, what Henry had written, and how the transactions matched the account statements. Each signature felt like closing a door. My hand remained steady. Elena reminded me that once the court and investigators received the documents, the process would no longer belong entirely to me. A later family agreement could not guarantee that a criminal inquiry would disappear. I understood. I understood that my uncle might never speak to me again, that relatives would accuse me of choosing a dead man over the living, and that people who had ignored Henry's suffering might call me cold for making it public. I also understood that I was finished auditioning for love from people who had already decided not to give it. I drove home afraid, but beneath the fear was relief. For the first time since childhood, I was no longer measuring my decisions, by whether they might make my mother reject me. The question was now whether Lorraine's use of Henry's money could survive independent review. The certified documents reached her on a Monday. She called that evening, and I allowed the call to go to voicemail. The first part of the recording was pure rage. She called me a liar, a parasite, and a nobody who had entered the family through pity. She said Henry should have left me on the porch where he found me. She accused me of jealousy and claimed I had always wanted what rightfully belonged to her. Then, in the middle of the message, her voice changed. The rage became soft and wet, almost tender. "Sweetheart," she said, using Henry's word although she had never called me that in her life. "Please, we can fix this. Family stays together. Drop the case, and you will still have a mother. Think about Lily. Does your daughter not deserve a grandmother? That promise would once have caught me immediately. You will still have a mother." It treated motherhood as a gift she might withdraw, rather than a responsibility she had never fulfilled. I listened to the message once, saved a copy for Elena because it related to the dispute, and did not respond. To someone who had rarely faced consequences, those feelings may have seemed identical. The court ordered an accounting and restricted any sale or transfer of the house until the estate dispute could be reviewed. Lorraine submitted her response near the deadline. As Elena predicted, it was thin, defensive, and unsupported. She categorized large transfers as caregiver reimbursements, informal family loans, and expenses paid on Henry's behalf. Yet there were no receipts for most of them. No signed loan agreements, no contemporaneous ledger, and no explanation for why money had been moved into an account she controlled rather than paid directly to a provider. A fiduciary cannot turn missing records into permission. Elena, Franklin, and I built a simple exhibit placing Henry's dated notes beside the matching bank activity. 400 on the 9th matched the transfer on the 9th. 600 on the 15th matched the next entry. The pattern continued through the certificate liquidation and the final total of $465,000. Henry's journal was important, but it did not stand alone. The bank records independently confirmed the amounts and dates he had written. The power of attorney established Lorraine's duty. Her own accounting admitted that she had received the money, even though she disputed why. Together, those pieces transformed the case from one grieving relative's suspicion into a documented financial trail. Elena looked at the completed exhibit and told me she had rarely seen a cleaner alignment between a vulnerable adult's private notes and objective records. I expected that statement to make me feel triumphant. Instead, I felt tired, sad, and steady. The night before the hearing, I laid out my clothes, placed Henry's blue journal in my bag, and read his final note one more time. "If you are reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them, and I am sorry." The next day, I would sit across from my mother and let Henry's records speak. The case no longer depended on whether Lorraine understood my pain. It depended on whether she could account for what she had done. The probate courtroom was small and paneled in dark wood. I sat beside Elena, while Franklin kept the blue journal behind us. Raymond, my aunt, and several cousins filled the gallery, but none chose the seats directly behind me. Lorraine entered with my father, Dennis, and an attorney wearing an expensive tie. Her vacation tan had faded into a polished gold beneath the fluorescent lights, and she carried herself as though she had arrived to observe someone else's disgrace. Dennis followed in a blazer that did not fit properly, looking from side to side as if searching for the safest place to stand. They sat with the confidence of people who had spent their lives assuming that certainty could substitute for accountability. When the hearing began, Elena summarized the accounting order, the fiduciary relationship, and the unexplained transfers. Lorraine's attorney responded by describing a difficult illness, informal family arrangements, and the confusion that often surrounds care at the end of a parent's life. He was skilled. He never called the money stolen. He called it reimbursement, assistance, expectation, misunderstanding, and the untidy result of a grieving family that had never documented its private arrangements. While he spoke, the judge repeatedly looked down at our exhibit. On one side were Henry's handwritten entries. On the other were the bank's records confirming the same dates and amounts. Lorraine's attorney could soften the language, but he could not make the figures disappear. A confident voice can redirect a conversation. It cannot change a running total. The judge questioned both sides about the certificate, missing receipts, and transfers into Lorraine's personal account. Her attorney called the gaps informal family bookkeeping. The records, however, showed that Lorraine had returned to Florida before Henry died, and that I, Marisol, and others had provided much of the care she later claimed to have reimbursed herself for. The judge called a short recess before hearing the remaining testimony. In the hallway, Lorraine's attorney approached Elena and asked whether we would consider resolving the civil dispute. Elena warned me privately that any agreement could address estate property and restitution, but it could not guarantee that adult protection investigators or prosecutors would abandon matters already reported to them. Even so, she allowed me to hear the proposal because the decision about the estate belonged to me as the petitioner. The offer was precise. Lorraine would return part of the missing money, not all of it. She would also transfer Henry's house to me. In exchange, I would dismiss the probate claims, sign a confidentiality agreement, and provide whatever lawful statement I could that I no longer wished to pursue the matter. The message beneath the legal language was familiar. Keep it inside the family, accept the house, and become quiet again. Then Lorraine stepped into the hallway. She softened her expression and reached toward my hand. Take the house, sweetheart, she said. Let us put this behind us. You will still have a mother. For a moment, the offer contained everything the abandoned child inside me had once wanted. The house was the place where Henry had placed a moon-shaped light beside my bed and taught me that I belonged somewhere. It held the porch we had painted, the kitchen table where he had helped with homework, and the light my mother had turned off while I stood outside. Lorraine was offering me the building, an end to the conflict, and the title of daughter, all in exchange for silence. I looked at her open hand and felt two futures separating in front of me. In one, I accepted the keys, swallowed the truth, and told myself that peace was worth the price. In the other, I refused the home I loved and allowed the evidence to reach whatever consequence it supported. The first future was warmer. The second was clean. Henry had attended every ordinary event of my life without asking what he would receive in return. I could not trade his final testimony for a house that had already been his. I drew my hand back. No, I said. It was only one word, spoken quietly. Lorraine's face emptied before anger rushed into it. She had expected negotiation, grief, or gratitude. She had not expected refusal. Elena ended the conversation, and we returned to the courtroom. When the hearing resumed, the exhibits were admitted into the record. Elena asked whether I could explain how I had prepared the reconciliation, and the judge allowed me to testify. I did not raise my voice or describe every wound my mother had caused. I approached the account the same way I would have presented an audit to a client, chronologically, with each conclusion tied to a document. I explained when Henry signed the power of attorney, when the transfers began, how I separated legitimate medical and household expenses, and how the account ending in the same 4 digits repeatedly received his money. I read selected lines from his journal. Money is tight again, and I do not know why. Then, she thinks I am too far gone to count. I am not. I just cannot stop her. For each dated entry, I directed the court to the matching bank record. Finally, I explained the early liquidation of the certificate and the total that resulted when all unsupported transfers were added together. $465,000. I told the judge that I was not asking for the money to be awarded to me. Henry had described the certificate as something he wanted used for good, and I intended, subject to the court's authority and the estate process, to direct any recovery toward older people who had no dependable family to help them. I also said I did not want the house for myself. If it returned to the estate, I wanted it transferred to an elder care organization in Henry's name. That was what finally broke Lorraine's control. The numbers had made her defensive, but the idea that I would give everything away made her furious. She rose before her attorney could stop her and shouted, "It was owed to me. It was mine. I earned it. I put up with that old man my entire life." The courtroom became completely silent. Her lawyer caught her arm and urged her to sit, but the words were already part of the hearing. She had not explained a reimbursement or a loan. She had described entitlement. In one uncontrolled sentence, she revealed the belief behind every transfer. Henry's money was hers because she considered herself his rightful blood heir, regardless of the duty she had accepted while he was alive. I looked at her and understood that I had won and lost something in the same moment. Henry's account had finally been heard. At the same time, whatever fantasy remained that Lorraine might become my mother had ended in front of strangers. Justice and grief arrived on the same bill. The judge reviewed the power of attorney, Lorraine's unsupported accounting, the bank records, the certificate liquidation, Henry's writings, and the testimony about his condition. He found that she had violated her fiduciary duty and used Henry's assets for herself. He ordered restitution of $465,000 and an additional bad faith surcharge that doubled her civil liability. Then he directed that the record be forwarded to the county prosecutor and the appropriate protective services investigators for review of potential elder financial exploitation. It was not a criminal conviction delivered from the probate bench. It was the formal referral that placed the evidence into the hands of authorities, empowered to investigate and charge the conduct. I watched the meaning reach Lorraine. The cream suit, pearls, and controlled posture suddenly looked like props from a performance that had ended. Dennis leaned slightly away from her, already measuring the distance between himself and the person beside him. I knew my father well enough to understand what that movement meant. If investigators offered him a way to reduce his own exposure by cooperating, he would take it. Loyalty had never been heavy enough for him to carry. Lorraine looked across the room at me. For 1 second, the mask slipped. What I saw was not remorse. It was fear, the genuine fear of someone who had spent her life believing that confidence could rewrite any account and had finally encountered a record that would not move. I did not feel triumphant. There was nothing joyful about watching my mother realize she might lose her freedom. I looked instead at Henry's blue journal and whispered, "Numbers do not grieve. They tell the truth." He had written while his hand shook, so that one day someone would have to listen. A town had filled his funeral, and now a courtroom had heard the words he could no longer speak. Lorraine found me on the courthouse steps. Dennis had already left to consult a separate attorney. My mother approached with every polished layer stripped away, her voice low and trembling. "I hope you are happy," she said. "You destroyed this family. You took everything from me. You were never one of us." For the first time in my life, her words could not reach anything vulnerable. I felt no urge to defend my place, no hunger for her approval, and no frightened child waiting to be chosen. "I did not take anything from you," I said. "You took it from him. I only wrote it down." Then I told her that our contact was over. She was not to call me, visit my home, or attempt to reach Lily. Any necessary communication would go through Elena. I did not shout or threaten her. I set the boundary the way I would close a ledger that had finally balanced, clearly and without leaving an entry open for later manipulation. Lorraine opened her mouth, but for once she had no prepared line. I walked down the steps and did not look back. I was not happy. Happiness is too simple a word for the end of something like that. But I felt lighter, because I had finally stopped carrying a debt to a mother who had never intended to settle it. The criminal process moved more slowly. Investigators reviewed the accounts, interviewed Henry's caregivers, and examined Lorraine's use of the power of attorney. Dennis cooperated, provided information about the Florida account, and testified against her for a lesser outcome. He received probation, but the town remembered both the beach and the bargain. Lorraine accepted a plea rather than face a jury with Henry's journal, the transfers, and her own statements. She was convicted of felony financial exploitation of an elder, ordered to continue restitution, and served time. I had preserved evidence and used the proper process. The consequences came from what she had done. Raymond received the silence he had requested, although not in the way he expected. Other relatives chose sides, repeated Lorraine's version, or gradually disappeared when it became clear there would be no inheritance waiting for them. Losing them hurt, but not as much as continuing to call people family while they protected the person who exploited Henry. Caleb changed his mind before the case ended. He apologized for asking me to walk away and admitted that fear had made him focus only on protecting our immediate household. He understood the full weight of my decision when he watched me reject Lorraine's offer of Henry's house. Later, he told me that was the moment he realized I was not fighting to acquire anything. I was fighting because a dead man's dignity should not depend on whether protecting it was convenient. The civil recovery arrived in pieces over the following year through returned assets, collections, and the sale of property subject to the estate's orders. I did not keep any of it. With the required approvals and legal structure in place, the recovered money funded a small charitable program named the Henry Whitmore Fund. Its purpose was simple: helping older people who had no reliable person to show up for them. The fund paid for rides to treatment, advocates during difficult meetings, basic home repairs, and companionship visits. Henry had once been accused, through me, of wasting his life on a charity case. In the end, his money extended the kind of charity he practiced: not pity from a distance, but presence with work attached. The house returned to the estate, and I transferred it to an elder care charity. The building where a frightened 7-year-old received a moon-shaped nightlight would shelter people with nowhere dependable to go. Keeping it would have turned Henry's home into a prize. I wanted it to remain a place where abandoned people were welcomed. On the day the charity took possession, Caleb and Lily came with me for one final visit. Lily was 6, fearless, and too young to understand the entire history. She ran across the yard while Caleb held my hand on the porch Henry and I had painted together. The porch light was burning. A week earlier, I had replaced the bulb and left it on. We sat on the top step as afternoon faded. I opened the blue journal to the last page and read Lily the final line her great-grandfather had written. "If you are reading this, sweetheart, then I was right about them. And I am sorry." Lily asked who he had been apologizing to. I told her that he was sorry because the people who were supposed to protect him had not shown up when he needed them. Then I told her the larger truth. One person had shown up for me throughout my entire life. And because he had, I learned how to stand when someone else needed the same thing. She did not fully understand. She was 6. One day, the journal will belong to her, and the dates, transfers, and trembling handwriting will explain more than I could explain on that porch. For now, it was enough for her to know that Henry loved her mother, and that love had consequences measured in ordinary acts. I know now that love is not what people say when an estate opens, or what they post while someone else carries the grief. It is the person in the chair when no audience is watching and nothing is owed. It is the porch light, the notes on a receipt, the soup carried through the door, and the hand that stays. Henry sat in that chair for me throughout my life. I wish I had understood his danger sooner. But I carried his journal into the room where it mattered, followed every number he left, and refused to trade his truth for a house or the promise of a mother. Lorraine called me Henry's charity case because she believed blood created the only right to belong. Now, whenever the Henry Whitmore Fund helps an older person reach treatment or places someone beside a lonely patient, I think about the truth she could not understand. I was raised by charity, the kind that opens the door, turns on the light, and stays. 2 empty chairs, a beach photograph, a message from a dead man's phone, and a blue journal in a cigar box. That was betrayal in my family. The truth did not restore the family I wanted, but it freed me from begging them to choose me. Henry had already chosen me every day that mattered. Showing up was the whole thing.